Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to attend this webinar where we will be talking about teacher well-being and exploring why it is important, and sharing the findings from a landscape review. So to begin, my name is Julia Jonah, and I work with Save the Children as an Education and Emergencies Advisor, and I will be helping to facilitate this webinar today. I would now like to introduce my colleague, Paul.
Hi, everybody. This is Paul Frasoli. I'm the Associate Director for Education and Emergencies at FHI 360. And this landscape review that we're going to be presenting today has been the ongoing work of the Equity Initiative Teacher Social Emotional Wellbeing Task Team in partnership with INEE, the Teachers in Crisis Context Collaborative, the Education Conflict and Crisis Network, and USAID. I'm going to pass this over to Danni.
Hi, everyone. My name is Danni Falk. I've been a consultant working on the landscape review on teacher well-being, and I'm currently a doctoral student at Teachers College.
Hi, everyone. My name is Varni. I've also been a consultant working on this landscape review, and I'm a recent graduate from the master's program at Teachers College.
Great. So before we get started, just to go over some main housekeeping items here, if you could all please mute your microphone and turn off your video, that would really help us to minimize any background noise. Also, as you'll notice, there's a chat function, so please feel free to post any questions that you have in the chat area at any time throughout the presentation. We will have time at the end to address these questions. Please also note that this session is being recorded, and the recording and presentation will be shared on the INEE website after the presentation is finished. So with that, just to go over the agenda for the webinar, so we'll begin with an introduction to the work and also go in a bit more detail of who those participating stakeholders have been to help develop this landscape review. We'll then really get into what is teacher well-being, what do we mean by this, and why is it important, as well as looking at what progress has been made so far in the sector and thinking about where we need to go in the future. We'll present the main findings of the teacher landscape review, which, as you see, and I'm sure that some of you have already seen it on the INEE website and the Education Equity Research Initiative website, is an excellent resource that looks at teacher well-being in low resource, crisis, and conflict-affected settings. And then we will conclude with an open discussion and Q&A. So to start, as Paul mentioned, there have been several actors that have been really critical to bringing this work to life and getting it to the point where we are today. So to give a bit of background about the Education Equity Research Initiative, the Education Equity Research Initiative is a collaborative of partnerships that connects different organizations and individuals that are all committed to building stronger evidence and knowledge and improving solutions for equity in the education sector. The initiative provides a learning forum that really brings together knowledge and expertise at the intersection of research, and taking some of this research to influence policy and also practice. Within the Education Equity Research Initiative, there are 3 task teams that are focused on generating data and evidence around the thematic areas of disability, gender, and teacher well-being. And the Teacher Well-being Task Team is the group that has kind of led the development of this Teacher Well-being Landscape Review. So as we know, over the past several years, there's been an increased interest in ensuring that education programs in emergency contexts are addressing the well-being needs of learners, in addition to supporting academic learning outcomes. However, thus far, there has been little attention paid to the critical importance of teachers' own well-being and the impact that teachers' well-being has on student development. So for many teachers in emergency contexts, we know that they're faced with very complex classroom climates. They have minimal support, training, supervision, limited resources, and also oftentimes inconsistent payment, all while simultaneously trying to deal with their own experiences of trauma and displacement. Across the sector, there's limited research and evidence about how teachers' well-being affects their ability to address such factors and more equitably impact student learning outcomes. So the Education Equity Research Initiative's Teacher Wellbeing Social-Emotional Task Team was formed to build evidence and greater understanding of the dynamics that influence teacher well-being and help us to identify what works most effectively. And to ensure coordination within the sector, the Education Equity Research Initiative joined forces with the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, INEE's Teachers in Crisis Context Collaborative, as well as INEE's Psychosocial Support and Social Emotional Learning Collaborative in the development of this landscape review. The Teachers in Crisis Context Collaborative, or TIC Collaborative, is dedicated to providing more and better support for teachers in crisis contexts. Members of this group work together to identify problem areas in teacher management, teacher development, and teacher support in crisis contexts, and also contribute interagency open source solutions. For lots of you, you're probably familiar with the TIC Teacher Training Pack and some resources on peer coaching and mentoring as well. INEE's Psychosocial Support and Social Emotional Learning Collaborative is also currently exploring the dimensions of and different ways to measure teacher well-being, because we know that without the provision of psychosocial support and the integration of social emotional and learning into education settings, this cannot be imagined. Therefore, these groups all came together since they're all interested in identifying effective ways to support teachers, and specifically teachers' well-being, and have worked together over the past several months to develop this landscape review. So with that background, now I will hand it over to Paul to help us understand what we really mean by teacher well-being.
Great, thank you, Julia. So really the crux of this landscape review came from the idea that when we're not focusing on teachers' well-being, there can be different consequences for different types of education actors and education systems. First and foremost, for teachers, we believe that teacher well-being is important for themselves. Teachers in low resource and education emergency contexts, they have one of the most stressful jobs in the world, and teachers really deserve to feel and function well in their jobs. And that's really a key point for why we would like to focus on teacher well-being for teachers' sake. We also know that when teachers are well, this can result in equitable outcomes for teachers, such as recruitment, retention of different types of teachers in the workforce, especially female teachers, effective teacher professional development. So for teacher outcomes, teacher well-being can be a key intervention or set of interventions. And for students, teacher well-being is linked to not only the quality of instruction and the quality of teacher-student relationships, but also the creation of a classroom climate that supports equitable outcomes for different types of children, especially some of the most vulnerable and marginalized children. There are studies that are starting to demonstrate that teacher well-being can directly affect student learning and student holistic outcomes. And there's also been a link to equity at the student level, where improving equitable education opportunities in the classroom, it can also be linked to teacher well-being. For education systems, we believe that teacher well-being can help with the recruitment, retention, preparedness of the teaching workforce and help to address teacher shortages. And then for achieving national, regional, and global education goals, this is also something that we believe can could be one ingredient to ensure that teachers are able to deliver quality instruction and create social cohesion in the classroom. This is in relation to the New York Declaration outlining its global commitment to refugees, the Global Compact and Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, where host countries are being asked to step up and include refugee students in their national education systems. So focusing on teacher well-being could be one way to help improve the quality of instruction and create social cohesion. And for SDG 4, that relates to quality and equitable education for all. We believe that teacher well-being could also be a more comprehensive and holistic way to support teachers as well. I'm just gonna. So what progress have we made to date in terms of the teacher well-being agenda? The equity initiative from November to January, we worked to recruit and hire Danni and Emily to start the teacher well-being landscape review. And they took on the work between February and April of this year, doing research and data analysis on teacher well-being. They'll talk more about their process in a moment. In April, there was a day-long workshop where we presented the conceptual framework for that Danni and Emily came up with at the Comparative and International Education Society conference, and that was a moment for different practitioners and researchers to engage with the content and the framework that we were building for this landscape review. And at the INEE working group meetings in Helsinki in May, we presented the draft version of the landscape review and got very detailed feedback from the INEE working groups. And today we published the landscape review at the end of last week. We have the webinar, and what's coming up for the teacher well-being work is we are talking with the TIC Collaborative to see about ways to officially launch the landscape review at the upcoming Teachers in Crisis Context Roundtable that will be held in Beirut from November 4th to 5th. And that roundtable will set forth a call to action on teachers in emergency settings related to teacher management, teacher professional development, and teacher well-being. Very exciting event coming up there. And the Equity Initiative and the INEE, we're looking at ways we can then create a teacher well-being measurement toolkit, validate the toolkit, and provide tools to the overarching education emergencies community to be able to learn more about the impacts of teacher well-being. And with that, I'm going to hand over the presentation to Danni. Danni, while I figure out how to, what to do here, I'll just let you go, and then I'll kick it over to you.
Thank you so much. So Emily and I are now going to provide a brief overview of the landscape review, whose objectives were to contribute to a more comprehensive understanding of teacher well-being, including the individual and contextual factors that support or hinder well-being, specifically in low-resource crisis and conflict-affected contexts, as well as develop an evidence-based framework for teacher well-being to inform future research, policy, and practice. We will explain our process of conducting and writing the landscape review by sharing the research questions, our methodology, the limitations of the landscape review, as well as two key outputs of the report, the conceptual framework and the key actions matrix. So the research questions guiding the landscape review were what individual and contextual factors influence teacher well-being, in what ways do these factors influence teacher well-being, and what are the unique needs and considerations for teachers working in low-resource, crisis, and conflict-affected contexts. We focused on occupational well-being of teachers, the definition of which is on the slide. And when we talk about teachers in crisis or conflict-affected contexts, we're really thinking about host community or national teachers working with displaced children, internally displaced teachers, refugee teachers, and returnee teachers, so teachers who have maybe been displaced either internally or internationally and who have returned to their country or community of origin. As the landscape review was commissioned by the Education Equity Research Initiative, we were also particularly interested in gaining insight into how teacher well-being promotes or impedes equity outcomes in school access, retention, and progression and learning for both teachers and students in these settings. So a bit about our methodology, and you'll have to excuse us for being brief, but there is a lot more in the actual review, but I'm going to spend the most time talking about our data analysis process. So in order to answer our research questions, we conducted a desk review. We drew on interviews with teachers working in displacement and low resource settings, specifically in Kenya and Uganda. And we held consultations with experts in the field of education and emergencies, psychology, and public health. For the desk review, given the paucity of literature and empirical evidence on teacher well-being, specifically in low resource crisis and conflict-affected contexts, we relied really heavily on research from Western and stable contexts and supplemented this with gray literature from conflict-affected settings. And in this process, we developed a matrix to organize and analyze the reviewed resources. And the matrix captured the resource type, so whether it was academic or gray literature, the sector, if it was an education publication or a publication from public health or psychology, the intervention, if there was a specific intervention that the publication was either evaluating or reviewing, the methodology of the research, including specific tools or measures of well-being, as well as the findings of the publication and limitations. And as an analytical tool during the writing process, this matrix allowed us to look across resources for comparisons, contradictions, and emerging themes. To assess the resources we reviewed, so thinking about how we did a quality check of the resources, we included the limitations of the literature in the matrix, as I just mentioned. And while we chose not to include resources with serious methodological flaws, which would be like lacking transparency about methods or definitions about key terms, given that this landscape review is not a systematic review, as well as the limited existing evidence on teacher well-being, particularly in contexts of crisis and displacement, we adopted a really inclusive approach to selecting resources and included a lot of emerging evidence, such as from NGO reports or from our own work in these settings. We also felt very strongly, as did Paul and Julia, that it was critical to include teachers' perspectives in the landscape review, as they are often excluded from research or policy or programming processes that affect them. So we drew on interviews with 14 teachers working in low resource and displacement contexts. This was in Uganda and Kenya, in a settlement in northern Uganda, and Kampala, as well as Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. And the interviews really helped inform our understanding of how teachers conceptualize their well-being. And it also allowed us to look at the ways in which the literature aligned with or contradicted the perspectives of the teachers. And finally, we also held expert consultations as we were doing the desk review and conducting and analyzing the teacher interviews. We held regular meetings with the task team from the Education Equity Research Initiative, who provided us with really invaluable insight and guidance in the research and writing process. And we also conducted 2 consultations with experts from the fields of psychology and public health. And as mentioned earlier, we held a great workshop at the CIES conference to solicit additional feedback for the conceptual framework, which Emily will talk about a little later. So finally, and then I'll turn it over to Emily, there are, of course, limitations within this landscape review that we want to touch on briefly. First, we were only able to draw on interviews with teachers in Uganda and Kenya. So while these teachers' perspectives are invaluable for this landscape review and informing the conceptual framework and the key actions matrix, their voices are not representative of teachers in low resource crisis and conflict affected contexts more broadly. Second, we reviewed only English language literature. Unfortunately, we lack fluency in a second language, but hopefully we'll work on that and change it. And we did not have the luxury of time or funding to work with translators or bilingual co-researchers. So while this is a limitation, it's also, we think, an opportunity for future research to bring in empirical evidence and literature from different language contexts. Third, and this is a pretty big one, the majority of the literature and empirical evidence we draw on in the landscape review is from Western contexts. So as previously mentioned, there's a dearth of literature and empirical evidence on teacher well-being, and the majority of existing work is from Western contexts. So we've done our best to supplement the literature from Western settings with gray literature and teachers' own perspectives, including instances where teachers maybe discussed well-being as a more collective construct. But we also feel that future research must seek to better understand endogenous concepts of well-being and promote participatory methodologies that include teachers and communities in every stage of the research process. And finally, the review does not provide detailed contextualization guidance, though we recognize contextualization as a key step in any meaningful and sustainable research programming and policy processes.
Great, thanks, Danny. So I'm going to briefly touch on our findings as well as some of the equity implications that we came across during our desk review. So the findings from the desk review and our interviews with experts and teachers resulted in a conceptual framework for teacher well-being. The framework provides a foundation for understanding the individual and contextual factors that influence teacher well-being, as well as a foundation for really understanding how to provide more comprehensive support to teachers and their well-being in these settings. So using the matrix that Danny talked about previously, we identified 4 constructs associated with teacher well-being. And these were the most common constructs that came out during our desk review. They were also most commonly present in the tools that we reviewed that are being used by researchers and practitioners to assess teacher well-being in these settings. And they also came up and were confirmed by our interviews with teachers in these contexts. So the 4 constructs are self-efficacy, job stress and burnout, job satisfaction, and social emotional competence. We also identified and examined in depth 16 factors, both individual and contextual, that influence teacher well-being. And again, these factors emerged most prominently from our literature review, as well as from the interviews with the experts and the teachers that we talked to in Kenya and Uganda. And we have a couple of examples of these factors on this slide, but we'll show all 16 factors on the next slide as well. The framework is a socio-ecological framework, so inspired by Bronfenbrenner's ecological model of child development. The framework recognizes the interrelated environments, interactions, and relationships that contribute to teacher well-being. So we looked at 6 levels: the individual, school, community, national, regional, and global level. And we really felt like this nested approach recognizes the interactions within and between these different settings and the ways that the factors situated at different levels are either contributing to or hindering teacher well-being. And especially thinking about low resource crisis and conflict affected contexts, the levels really recognize the different and varied roles that educators are playing within their school as well as outside of school settings, and how those different roles are also affecting their occupational well-being. Finally, we used a protective and risk factor framing. So really what this means is that we just recognize that each of the 16 factors we examined can either contribute positively to support teacher well-being or contribute negatively and hinder their well-being. So protective factors being those that enhance the likelihood of positive outcomes, and risk factors being ones that increase the chance of a negative outcome. And really, we think it's important to just underscore that each of the 16 factors can act as either a protective or risk factor for teachers, depending on the teacher profile, the context that the teacher lives and works in, and one factor can contribute positively at one point to teacher well-being and then later contribute negatively. So this is a visual of the conceptual framework that I just outlined, and I'll just walk through it rather briefly. So you'll see in the top left-hand corner, those are the 4 teacher well-being constructs that were examined. And then the influencing factors you'll see are situated across the different socio-ecological levels. So you'll see here that we examined 8 factors at the teacher level: gender, displacement status, level of education, coping mechanisms, employment status, teaching experience, content knowledge, and cultural competence. At the school level, we examined 4 factors: peer relationships, teacher-student relationships, school leadership, and school resources. At the community level, we looked at access to basic needs, respect and recognition, and responsibility and duty. And then at the national, regional, and global levels, we really looked at the policy environment, particularly around teacher management, right to work, compensation, professional development, and certification. And again, really considering the different teacher profiles that Danni outlined earlier, and trying to understand how these policies might be affecting the teachers differently in different settings. And you'll see that the socio-ecological levels are represented by these nested circles or ovals, and the protective and risk factor framing that I discussed is represented by the arrows on the side. So again, just making sure we're recognizing that all of these factors can contribute either positively or negatively to well-being. And then finally, just to highlight at the bottom there, this framework is aligned with the INEE minimum standards. And this will become a bit more clear when we talk about how to operationalize and apply this conceptual framework in a bit. And we'll go into a bit more detail about how to apply the framework in a little, but just to say briefly that this framework feeds in and informs our key actions matrix, which sort of outlines key actions at different levels that people can take to better support teacher well-being. So just briefly, as Paul and Julia mentioned, and Danni, we were really interested in understanding the equity implications of teacher well-being. And we have more implications outlined in the full report, but just to touch on some of the higher level ones. So through our desk review, we found research and evidence that supports the link between well-being and equitable outcomes for teachers, students, as well as entire school systems. So for example, research suggests that higher levels of attrition disproportionately affect schools in low-income communities and disproportionately affect teachers of color. Students in these schools experience a revolving door of teachers, many of whom are less experienced, early career teachers who are not provided with continuous access to professional development. This instability, as well as the limited access to experienced teachers, have the potential to disrupt student learning and negatively influence student well-being. And just to note that this research on high turnover rates and high levels of attrition disproportionately affecting low-income communities is primarily from the US, but absolutely applicable to crisis and conflict-affected contexts. So again, just to keep in mind here that the teacher profiles we're considering, for displaced teachers internally or refugee, the stress of living in displacement, of living in an insecure environment absolutely compounds with the stress that they're experiencing at their jobs. And additionally, attrition levels in these contexts are also very high for things such as ongoing conflict, targeted attacks on teachers and schools, and also the mobility of populations in these settings. So we also found that teacher turnover has huge cost implications for entire schools and districts. So higher turnover again is happening in more impoverished areas where systems cannot necessarily afford to retain and train high quality teachers, which has huge equity implications again for the students in these school systems. So for example, just to sort of think about the costs associated with high turnover, in the US, the annual cost of teacher turnover is about $7 billion. And in urban school districts, the cost of replacing teachers who leave the profession is about $20,000 per teacher. So pretty astronomical costs, and again, happening in districts with low resources who aren't able to invest in the system to replace and retain these teachers. On a more positive note, one of the equity implications we also came across was that improved teacher social-emotional competence. And if you'll remember back to the conceptual framework, social-emotional competence is one of the constructs associated with teacher well-being that we examined. So improving teachers' social-emotional competence can help to narrow the achievement gap among children at risk of school failure. So thinking about enabling teachers to better identify and attend to students' different academic and emotional needs, increasing the quality of education provided to those students, and increasing the likelihood of equitable student achievement.
So in the landscape review, we provide pretty dense and robust definitions of all of the four teacher well-being constructs, as well as the 16 factors that Emily reviewed. So we encourage everyone, and we'll send links in the chat box at the end, if you haven't looked at the landscape review, to definitely download it and flip through it for more definitions of all of the constructs and factors, as well as additional equity implications. But now we want to spend a little time talking about another major output of the landscape review, which is the key actions matrix. And as Emily mentioned, this matrix is one way to operationalize the conceptual framework by providing activities for supporting teacher well-being at the various levels of the conceptual framework. So at the individual or teacher level, the school level, the community level, as well as the national, regional, and global levels. The actions in this matrix aim to provide comprehensive support to teachers in low resource, crisis, and conflict-affected contexts, including their well-being. So of course, these actions are designed to support teacher well-being, but it's a bit more comprehensive than that. And we feel as though the matrix provides really good guidance for support more generally to teachers working in these settings. And overall, all of the actions in the matrix aim to achieve the teacher well-being outcomes that are listed on this slide. So the foundational outcomes, which is increased self-efficacy, improved social-emotional competence, and improved classroom climate, which then will lead to intermediate outcomes of increased teacher retention, improved student learning and well-being outcomes, and strengthened relationships between schools and communities, and will ultimately result in system-level outcomes with high numbers of experienced teachers with increased capacity to mentor novice teachers, which links to one of the factors around peer collaboration at the school level of our conceptual framework. Another system-level outcome is more equitable access to learning for students, increased student completion and transition rates, and more gender-sensitive, equitable recruitment and deployment of teachers, which ultimately will lead to more sustainable education systems. And we'll show you an example of the key actions matrix in the next slide. But before we do, I also just want to note that the key action matrix also provides process guidance for global, national, and local education stakeholders. So examples of those stakeholders may be ministries of education, teacher training colleges, and local education institutions, communities and families themselves, NGOs and donors, just to name a few. And the process guidance is around providing comprehensive contextualized support for teachers, again, at all of these levels that we outlined in the conceptual framework, the individual, school, community, and national levels. This guidance is summarized on the slide. So we really feel that efforts to improve teacher well-being should follow a participatory process that includes and values the perspectives and experiences of teachers, that works across relevant sectors, so not just education, but thinking about labor and finance and fields. When we're thinking about well-being, of course, we also need to acknowledge mental health and psychosocial support. And this should all happen in the policy design, program planning and implementation, and assessment and monitoring. And of course, contextualization is key. So everything should be contextualized. The activities we have below are more general or high level, I should say, but we recognize that the process that stakeholders take in making the key actions matrix actionable will need to be heavily contextualized depending on the community where the stakeholders are working.
Perfect. So this just provides an example of some of the actions outlined in the matrix. So this is an example of some of the activities on the teacher or individual level, as you'll see on the left-hand column there. So this is really thinking about keeping those teacher characteristics, experiences, and perspectives at the center of programs and policies in order to provide support that is relevant, responsive, and sustainable. So as Danni also mentioned, you'll see that the actions each correspond to the INEE minimum standards as well. So that purple or blueprint on your screen makes linkages to the minimum standards. And again, this individual level is really thinking about actions that improve cultural competence, content knowledge, and get at the other factors that are outlined on the individual level of the conceptual framework. So just to provide one more brief example, these are some of the actions at the community and national level that can be implemented to provide more comprehensive support to teachers and their well-being. So for example, thinking about at the community level, conducting risk and resource mapping to understand existing structures, resources, and individuals that may be serving as protective and risk factors for teachers, using humanitarian needs assessments to better understand teacher professional development needs. And again, that purple and blue font, looking at where there are linkages to the INEE minimum standards. So really just to underscore that this matrix is meant to be useful for practitioners, policymakers, academics, and also at an advocacy level. We did our best to operationalize the research and the evidence that informs the conceptual framework, and really to make it clear that multiple stakeholders can be taking action at all these different levels to provide better support to teachers in these settings. So really highlighting the fact that it takes change at the individual level, but all the way up through sort of the system level to make sure that we're addressing these challenges and supporting teachers in the most sustainable and relevant ways possible.
And I'll just quickly point out on the right-hand side, you'll see these columns that have X's in them, and we're sorry, we couldn't figure out how to fit the full matrix in a PowerPoint slide, but again, in the landscape review, the full key actions matrix will be available, as well as a bit more introduction and guidance around how to use it. But these three columns on the side indicate the phase of response where we think the key action would be most relevant. So there would, if you could imagine, there would be a row above this individual teacher-related slide. And on the right-hand side, it would be phase of crisis, where it would be emergency, or acute crisis, protracted crisis, and then, of course, recovery. And again, this is linked to the INEE minimum standards, as well as different resources that INEE has published around working in crisis and conflict-affected contexts.
So just really briefly, before we open it up for questions, we wanted to highlight just 3 recommendations for future research. The full report contains many more recommendations. We actually ended up outlining about 20 areas for future research. And really that is in large part due to the huge gap in research and evidence on teacher well-being, particularly again in crisis and conflict-affected settings. So just 3 that we wanted to highlight today. The first one, contextualization. So again, to Danny's point, using participatory methodologies and applying this conceptual framework to different low resources, crisis, and conflict-affected contexts to really identify which factors are consistent across these settings, which ones are different, and to make sure that we're adapting and adjusting the framework as necessary to best support teachers. So again, just to underscore that the factors and the constructs that we examine were the ones that emerged most prominently from the research and evidence base, but they are by no means an exhaustive or final list, and we really recognize the additional contextualization and adaptation that will go into using this conceptual framework in different settings. Secondly, we just wanted to highlight teacher attrition and mobility. So thinking about conducting longitudinal research on the reasons that teachers in these settings are staying in or leaving the profession, exploring teacher mobility and the ways in which it influences certain outcomes for teachers. So thinking again about attrition, cross-border certification, and then finally, just thinking more about equity implications in crisis and conflict-affected contexts. So further examining the relationship between teacher well-being and student well-being and learning in these settings, as well as the ways in which teacher well-being influences equitable outcomes for teachers themselves, students, and then of course entire education systems. So really, as is made very apparent by this entire presentation, we really feel it's imperative to provide more comprehensive support to teachers in these settings to ensure that the most marginalized populations are receiving equitable and quality education opportunities. And as Paul mentioned in the beginning, there really is a window of opportunity with policies such as the New York Declaration and the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework to ensure that teachers and teacher well-being are a core consideration when we're operationalizing these policies in different settings. So again, just really keeping teachers at the center of policy, practice, and research, and making sure that we're recognizing that better support to teachers also means better outcomes for students and education systems as a whole. So thank you so much for joining and listening, and I think now we'll open it up for questions that you've been sending in the chat box. And just to say, we'd really love to hear from you. We can send through a link to the landscape review in the chat box right now, and we'd love to hear from you as you read the review, as you start to use the resources that we just went over in your work. So definitely feel free to email all 4 of us with questions, comments.
Thank you so much, Danny and Emily, for taking us through the work that you've done in developing the landscape review. It was a really rich presentation, and we can tell because there's already been 2 great questions. Thank you for those of you that have submitted questions so far. I hope that they can continue coming as we open this up now to discussion. So first from Margie, good question. She's curious if in the teacher interviews, concepts of safety and security arose as an aspect of how teachers view their well-being. So can you speak to that maybe, Danni and Emily, from the research that you did talking to teachers?
Yeah, definitely. And thank you so much for that question. Safety and security came up a lot in the interviews that we conducted in Palabek settlement, in northern Uganda, as well as in Kampala and in Kakuma refugee camp. And we've, I guess, situated those two really important issues under the community level factors within the conceptual framework, under access to basic needs. We felt, and we actually struggled a bit about where to place safety and security because we felt it was pretty cross-cutting, especially actually across all levels, but especially at the individual teacher level, the school level, of course, and we ended up inserting it at the community level because what we found to be most prominent were teachers' concerns about safety and security within their community that affected either their transportation to and from school or that affected their learners. Once they went home from school, the security concerns that not only teachers themselves faced, but that teachers recognized their learners were facing in the community. So we have a lot more on safety and security in the narrative of the landscape review on the community level. And if you look at the landscape review, it would be on page 29 and 30. So thank you for that really important question.
Great, thank you so much. And then another question came in from Megan. Is there any guidance on the cost of each and their relative impact on each, i.e. with a limited budget, where is a good starting point? She said, I imagine there's not enough data to answer my question, but is there any data on this, or maybe even just hearing your thoughts?
Yeah, so that's a great question as well. And I think just starting with what we found during the landscape review, unfortunately, there really isn't enough data on the relative impact or the cost of each of these sort of intervention points, particularly in crisis and conflict-affected settings. But really the hope and what we sort of outline in the recommendations for future research as well is that further work and research and adaptation of the conceptual framework in these settings will result in the data that can help us determine how much does each intervention cost, where should we be starting, to your point, if we're working off of a limited budget, and where can we invest even the smallest amount of resources to start making a difference for teachers.
Great, thank you. Another question from Emmanuel. So you did acknowledge a limitation on that the research is heavily focused in Western context. So he would like to know, please share what informed this direction or approach. Was it due to lack of contextually relevant literature, inadequate resources, or something else? And then how will this be corrected in future exercises? So, I mean, I guess I can speak to that just for a moment and then turn it over to you, Danni and Emily. But I think we were really interested in seeing what is already out there, right? What research does exist. And unfortunately, as you, Danni, and Emily mentioned earlier, there just is not a lot of research from non-Western contexts yet. And that is why, you know, we do recognize the publication of this landscape review, which includes key recommendations, as a real opportunity to ensure that this research is generated in non-Western contexts moving forward. But I think, you know, it really was due to just lack of available resources. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
No, that's exactly right, Julia. And I think that one thing that we highlighted to be corrected in the future that was actually a priority for the task team from the Education Equity Research Initiative was to source literature from other languages. but unfortunately, just due to the limited time frame of the consultancy and the budget that we had, we were not able to do that adequately, and we really encourage, because we're sure that there is literature that exists in other languages. We encourage scholars and practitioners to dive with the language skill sets to dive into that literature.
And one thing, this is Paul, I just wanted to add on to this as well. This is a relatively new topic in many contexts. So the systematic reviews and also, the very experimental studies are emerging throughout many contexts. So throughout education emergencies and low resource contexts and in the United States. So this is an emerging field. But we felt like this for vulnerable contexts or education emergencies context, this is a topic of utmost importance given the even more stressful, potentially more stressful conditions that teachers are faced in. And then another thing just to note is that we also pulled from, in humanitarian things, we also pulled from mental health related evidence. So that was kind of also our attempt to bridge that gap in terms of the evidence in a variety of contexts.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so moving on to another question from Nina. She's wondering if there's any link or recommendations on how to move forward to national and even global level advocacy. As she notes that we've noticed that ILO and UNESCO recommendations concerning the status of teachers and the UNESCO recommendation concerning the status of higher education teaching personnel do not include any reference to teacher well-being. And neither does the National Teacher Policy to Increase Teacher Quality in Uganda. It doesn't mention teacher well-being. I think that's a really great question, Minna. Danni, Emily, any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in the key actions matrix at the national level, we have a few suggested activities that address just that. So we'll send through the link for the full report. And just for reference, this is on page 50. But just to note that one of the actions at the national level is to review national teacher competency frameworks to see if and how issues related to teacher well-being are included and the extent to which these frameworks include guidance around working with displaced teachers and students. Another one is to advocate for the inclusion of teacher well-being in national education policies, integrating support for teacher well-being into teacher training colleges and other national and local education institutions. And then just to touch on the ILO piece, thinking about connecting to other sectors. One of the actions is also to collaborate across ministries, so thinking about education, labor, finance, social welfare, to allow displaced teachers access to benefits from different professional development and training programs, to allow them access to certification and right to teach and work in their communities of displacement. So we definitely get at that national policy piece and sort of advocacy in the actions framework. But such a good question, such a good point to keep in mind.
Thank you. Yeah, great. Okay, and then we have one more question that's been written into the chat box from Anjali. So what are your observations from teachers' perspectives or from the literature on whether interventions to support teacher occupational well-being should be sequenced to be most effective? So, for example, is safety a prerequisite that must be handled first? If you address classroom level stress alone, is that adequate, etc.? She wants to know if you saw across the existing literature that there are common measures used to assess these constructs. So I guess maybe first, yeah, do you think that there is, or did you find anything about sequencing?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think Emily and I were just discussing as we were reading through some of the questions that it really would depend on the context. So that's not a very clear or helpful answer, I guess I would say, but I think sequencing would very much rely or be dependent upon the environment, both the school and the community in which the teachers are working. I know, for example, that in northern Uganda, where we were doing interviews with teachers, salary was one of the most prominent components of teacher well-being because the environment that they were living in was relatively safe. So safety was not the first and foremost concern. And I guess if we're thinking about sequencing, then maybe safety would have to be there first, but this is us just speculating on what we heard from the teachers given the context that they were working. I definitely think future research should look into whether sequencing is important in terms of how well-being should be prioritized or addressed by individuals working to support teacher well-being. But for us in this review, what stood out the most, I think, is just the need to understand the context in which teachers are working.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I know that there are some other questions that have been written into the chat box, and thank you so much for these. Just due to time, we're going to have to end here, so if your question was not able to be answered by the presenters, fear not, because responses will be added to the presentation slides before it's uploaded to the INEE website. So thank you for taking the time to ask these questions, and you can find your answers there. So thank you everyone so much for participating in the webinar today. We hope that you really enjoyed learning more about teacher well-being and also learning about the work that the Education Equity Research Initiative has been doing with INEE and also through the support of USAID and ECCN. So thank you again. And thank you so much to Danny and Emily. Paul and I co-chair the Teacher Wellbeing Task Team of the Education Equity Research Initiative, but none of this would have been possible without the amazing work of Danny and Emily, so thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for listening and sticking with us through this webinar, and thanks so much to Paul and Julia too for all the support and guidance. And we're really excited to have this resource out there and can't wait to hear how you use it.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks, bye.